Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. Once again, the week began with Labour chaos, this time over a ceasefire in Gaza, and ended with Tory embarrassment. My fellow television presenter, Lee Anderson, seems to have accepted that his side hustle as MP for Ashfield may be coming to an end after the Conservative Party suspended him yesterday. You should have stuck to the autocue, mate. But this morning, the shenanigans of party politics pale in comparison to the fact that at least 3 female MPs now require bodyguards, and dozens more employ private security firms to protect their offices. We don't know who those MPs are, nor, in my opinion, should we. But the real point is that for the first time since the 17th century, when Charles I and then later Oliver Cromwell marched into the House of Commons and threatened MPs at sword point, it seems that our elected representatives are acting out of fear rather than out of conviction. It's easy for those of us whose families are not at risk to be heroic, but this is how a democracy dies. Most MPs will, I hope, resist the pressure to surrender their independence. We'll ask this morning what we need to do to help them protect our democracy. A little earlier, I spoke to Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden. Let's talk about your party. The former Deputy Chairman, Lee Anderson, has been suspended for saying that the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is in control of his Islamist mates, I think is the expression you used. The Mayor replied that these remarks were Islamophobic and racist. Does Mr Anderson's suspension mean that the Conservative Party regards Mr Anderson as a racist?
The reason why the party took the decision to suspend the whip from Lee Anderson was that what he said was wrong and words matter. And he was given the opportunity to apologise and he didn't do so. So therefore, we removed the whip. What I would say is more broadly, we also need to take very, very seriously what has been going on in the past week or so in Parliament. It cannot be. These two are related, which is that we should not be distracted from the underlying issue here that has been going on this week. So we cannot allow the kind of violence that we've seen and the threats and intimidation, whether it's against Jewish people on the streets of this country, whether it's in those marches, and now apparently it coming to affect the what's going on in Parliament. And the two are related in the sense that we should not allow one to distract from the other.
We've got time, and I do want to talk about that, but let's just deal with Mr Anderson for the moment. The question I asked you is does the Conservative Party's suspension of Mr Anderson mean that at least he is suspected of being a racist?
Well, what the words that he chose to use were not the right words to use. They were the wrong words, and words do matter. And he was given that opportunity to apologise, and he didn't. So I do not accept the words that he used. He shouldn't have used those words, and that's why, having failed to apologise, we have withdrawn the whip. But as I say, Trevor, it's essential that we look at the underlying issues as well. And I think it's entirely right that as a party and as a government, we face up to what has been happening recently.
I want to do that, but I just want to get past this specific issue. And I'm noticing I'm not hearing the word no in answer to my question. But let me ask you just a very specific question. Is he still your candidate in Ashfield while he's suspended?
Well, in terms of the pure process, when the whip is suspended, that relates to someone's conduct in Parliament. When it comes to a reselection process, that would be something that would happen much further down the line.
All right, let's talk about some remarks from other members of the party. Suella Braverman says that we're sleepwalking into a ghettoised society where Sharia law, the Islamist mob and anti-Semites take over communities. Now, you booted Lee Anderson out for his remarks. Why is Suella Braverman still in the party? Why does she still have the whip?
Well, and this goes to what I was trying to say a little earlier, Trevor, in respect of what Lee Anderson said, and it pertains to what Suella said, which is that I don't shy away for a moment from facing up to what is happening right now. And I think all of us need to look ourselves in the mirror and say, what have we allowed our society to become? where I see from my own constituents, where Jewish people are fearful of walking the streets showing symbols of their own religion, where we have hate on marches, and now we have the situation where the actual conduct of Parliament is apparently being influenced by threats of violence and intimidation. And I think all of us have a responsibility to face up to what's happening here. It is un-British, and we must take this as a wake-up call not to allow this to happen. And I support anyone who calls this out. And indeed, you've seen the words from the Prime Minister expressing our grave concern about this.
The Prime Minister does not mention Mr. Anderson in his article today, so let me ask you directly. When you talk about the way in which the sentiment is being expressed, are we talking about Lee Anderson attack on Sadiq Khan? Are we talking about Suella Braverman talking about the Islamist mob? Are we talking about Liz Truss saying we need a bigger bazooka? Is this the kind of language that Conservatives now plan to employ?
Well, Trevor, I have said several times, and I'm happy to say again, that I don't agree with the language that was used by Lee Anderson. But nonetheless, it is the case that I feel strongly that we have allowed ourselves to get to get to a situation where violence, threats of violence and intimidation are seeking to influence debate in this country. This is not acceptable. It's not British. It's a cause of worry to me. It's a cause of worry to my constituents and many people up and down this country. And I think all of us owe a responsibility. But forgive me, just all of us owe a responsibility to call this out, whether it's people who are participating on the marches. When people participate on those marches, they need to ask themselves who they are marching alongside. Now, when it comes to the wording used by individual Conservatives, I've said that I disagreed with the language used by Lee Anderson. It was right for him to apologise, and his failure to apologise meant that we had the whip withdrawn. I don't believe that the language used by Suella Braverman has crossed the line whereby she should apologise for it. No, I don't.
One clear signal of where the Conservative Party might be going is what you decide to do if Mr. Nigel Farage applies for membership of the Conservative Party. If he were to apply, would you welcome him back?
Well, I, like many hundreds of thousands of Conservatives up and down the country, have spent many years campaigning against parties led by Nigel Farage. So, no, I don't support Nigel Farage rejoining the Conservative Party.
The point I'm really trying to get at here, Deputy Prime Minister, is that right now we don't quite know what Tory party we're being asked to vote for. Is it the old school, genteel, One Nation Conservative Party that I think most people associate with Oliver Dowden? Or is it this modern, brash, take no prisoners conservatism of Lee Anderson, Liz Truss and Suella Braverman? Who are you?
Well, I think what I've been trying to get across to you, Trevor, in my answers, and maybe I haven't been doing it very well, is to say that I don't think that it's incompatible being a One Nation Conservative, as I am, Boris Johnson, and many others have been.
Boris Johnson
was certainly a One Nation Conservative in the past. But calling out these kind of threats and intimidation, actually, as a One Nation Conservative who believes in our nation and defending the values of this nation, one of the most precious values of our country is free speech, free expression, and our parliamentary democracy. And we have seen in the past week threats to that parliamentary democracy, and in a situation that I think you would have scarce believed a few years ago, where the conduct of the House of Commons could be influenced by threats of violence. And I do not think that it's not One Nation Conservative or Conservative to call that out, and I support the calling out of it.
The person who's supposed to guarantee or lead on the conduct of the House of Commons is the Speaker. After this week, should he stand down?
Well, I think the Speaker has serious questions to answer about what happened, and that's what the Leader of the House will be asking about on Monday. I like the Speaker personally. I backed him for the leadership. I think he made a serious error of judgment in allowing outside threats to influence what happened in the House of Commons. However meaningfully he did it, it was a major misjudgment, and I think he needs to account for himself for that.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you so much for your time this morning. OK, let's talk to Labour now. After a week when the party dodged a tricky ceasefire vote and managed to get its own amendment on Gaza selected for debate. But party leader Keir Starmer was accused of bullying the Commons Speaker Lindsay Hoyle in the process. The party's shadow international development minister, Lisa Nandy, joined me now. Your leader says that he didn't lean on the Speaker to rip up parliamentary conventions this week. If it wasn't Sir Keir who did that, did anyone else from Labour threaten to withdraw the party's support from Sir Lindsay?
No, I'm absolutely certain of that. I mean, you never say you're certain of things in politics in case they come back to bite you. But actually, I don't believe for a moment that anyone in Labour did. And certainly our Chief Whip, Keir Starmer, none of the senior figures in Labour would ever dream of threatening the Speaker. I mean, I've been an MP for 14 years. That is not what you do. The idea that speakers can be pushed around by members of Parliament, leaders of political parties, is frankly for the birds. There were MPs from all political parties who made representations to the Speaker, not just about their safety and security, but also about the fact that we've got an impending ground invasion in Rafah. There was an urgent need for the House of Commons to speak with one voice to prevent that from happening and to back an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. And there were real concerns, particularly amongst many of our MPs, about the Tory motion not going far enough and the SNP motion lacking balance. I think he made the right decision, and if the Tories hadn't withdrawn their vote, Parliament would have had the chance to take a view on all of the propositions before us.
Let's go back to talk to the big event coming this week, the Rochdale by-election. In that by-election, who should Labour supporters vote for?
Well, we don't have a candidate, I'm afraid, so I can't answer that question. I was asked earlier this week what I would do. My colleague Wes Streeting said he would probably spoil his ballot paper. My answer is I would just ask people not to vote for candidates who are spouting hate and division. We've had enough of that. We've seen it from the Conservative Party this weekend. We need politicians and leaders who can stand up for public decency and integrity and speak for all people in this country, bring people together at a time when many people are feeling understandably frightened. Can you identify any of the candidates on the list who is not spouting hate for us? You can identify two or three if you want. No, I mean, I'm afraid I can't endorse a candidate in this race. That is the consequence of us having taken the unprecedented step to withdraw our candidate. Not to vote for people who are spouting hate. And I think it would be helpful to the public to know which candidates, in your opinion, answer to that description. Well, you're asking me as a Labour representative to start endorsing candidates from other political parties. I'm afraid I can't do that. I think the best option would have been to have a good Labour candidate. Just very quickly, do you regret going out leafleting last Sunday for 2 Sundays ago, I beg your pardon, for Mr. Azhar Ali after you knew he had said the things that we now know he said? Well, I didn't know that he'd made anti-Semitic comments. I was appalled by what he said about Israel, as was the Labour Party, and we had a pre-scheduled community event that I'd been asked to continue to do. Okay. I wouldn't campaign for a candidate who was anti-Semitic. As soon as those comments came to light, he was withdrawn as the candidate, and rightly so. And I regret the fact that we're going to the polls on Thursday without a Labour candidate, especially in a race as important as this. Okay. But it was the right thing to do. We will always stand up against racism where we see it. OK, last question, if I may, on Mr. Lee Anderson. Has the Conservative Party done the right thing in a timely fashion to essentially sack Mr. Anderson? I think what's going on in the Conservative Party is dangerous, and it's bigger than Lee Anderson. You've got somebody who was the Deputy Chairman under Sunak, somebody who was the Home Secretary under Sunak, somebody who the Conservative Party made Prime Minister 18 months ago, who have repeatedly sought to stoke hate and division, spouting conspiracy theories that are normally confined to the sort of thing that we see online, and a Prime Minister who's standing on the sidelines watching our political discourse being dragged into the gutter. It's dangerous. It seems to be very widespread, as Saeed Avarsi said quite compellingly yesterday, that there is a rot at the heart of the Conservative Party. We need leaders who are going to stand up to this sort of bile, not stoke it.
Thanks very much indeed, Lisa Nandy, for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Well, of course, I've been speaking to Lisa Nandy about the Rochdale by-election, so here is the full list of candidates and the political parties they represent. This is after the Labour Party withdrew its support for Azhar Ali, but he will still appear on voting papers as the party's candidate because the deadline to change it had passed. Now, the by-election is going to be held this coming Thursday on the 29th of February. This weekend, of course, marks the 2-year anniversary of the bloody war in Ukraine. Western leaders have travelled to Kiev in a show of support for President Zelensky, who's urged Ukrainians to keep fighting and says Russia cannot destroy his country's dreams. But hanging over proceedings is a growing fatigue on the part of Ukraine's allies, most importantly, the United States, and a risk that the military and financial support so desperately needed to fight a war against Russia could be drying up. The implications of defeat are far wider than the cost to Ukraine itself. I'll speak to the former Deputy US National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes. There's a consensus on this side of the Atlantic that Ukraine should get what Ukraine needs. Doesn't seem to be that way in Washington. Is that $60 billion package ever going to be shaken loose?
Well, I think, Trevor, right now it looks a little doubtful. And the irony is actually, I don't think that the public opinion in the United States differs that much from Europe. I think there's a majority of Americans who support Ukraine. I think there's a majority of members of Congress who would support this package. It's passed the United States Senate. It's stuck in the United States House of Representatives because you have a Speaker of the House who has to bring that legislation to the floor of the House for a vote, Mike Johnson. And he's now taking his cues completely from Donald Trump, who's the de facto leader of the Republican Party, the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, and who, for his own ideological purposes and political purposes, has decided to draw a hard line against any assistance package being passed for Ukraine. And so as long as Trump is kind of pulling the strings in that party, it's going to be very hard to move that supplemental package through the House of Representatives.
There is some talk, I hear, of Biden trying to persuade Joe Biden to stand down, maybe trying to get his principal advisor, who I gather is Jill Biden, to say, look, it's time to go, and leaving it to the party convention in August to choose a candidate. Is there any chance at all, in your view, of that happening?
Well, I mean, look, I think it's really unlikely. As you said, we're past the stage when that can be done through voting, through the primary process. Joe Biden has expressed every intention of running. His kind of inner circle, who I knew from the Obama years, but not necessarily part of, though, they clearly feel committed to him running. He clearly thinks that he's the best candidate to take on Donald Trump. But look, we can't ignore the fact that he's a, deeply unpopular president heading into a re-election. There are concerns, obviously, about his age. Those are hard concerns to address. It's not like a different kind of political problem that you can take on. I think the expectation, though, is that he'll be the nominee. Something pretty drastic would have to happen between now and the Democratic convention this summer for that to change. And again, the only place where that really could change is at that convention, where there are procedural ways to have a different nominee. But I think for now, the reality is we're looking at a Trump-Biden rematch. And so that's two politicians who have pretty significant vulnerabilities going up against each other. And one way to look at it, Trevor, is essentially if this election can become a referendum on Donald Trump, I think that benefits Joe Biden more. If this election is a referendum on Joe Biden, I think that benefits Donald Trump more. And that's the kind of election season that we're heading into.
Isn't it a great thing for democracy that it's going to be decided by voters choosing the candidate they least like and voting for the other guy?
I don't think it's the best thing, frankly. And, you don't see that kind of groundswell of enthusiasm that you even had, by the way, in the first Trump election. Trump is not as popular even as he was a few years ago. I mean, he he swept this South Carolina primary, but he lost 40% of the vote. And a lot of those voters said that they don't even want to vote for for Donald Trump, and they're Republicans. So it's not going to be a high enthusiasm election, but it's going to be a high stakes election. And like the last couple of American elections, it's going to come down to a few states. People tend to look at our national polls. Really, there's 4 or 5 states that are going to matter here because the country's so polarized that Biden and Trump are each going to kind of hold their terrain and just fight it out in a few places. And frankly, there's an enormous amount at stake, as we've been talking about, not just in the United States, but around the world, in terms of what a few tens of thousands of people decide to do in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and perhaps Arizona.